I'm Michelle from How Much Sleep Paper Blooms. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make a sunflower from crepe paper. This tutorial is actually going to teach you how to make two different sunflowers. The design is very similar, it's more the size of the petals that changes, but there are two. So there's this smaller design which is like your standard sunflower size, and then the extra large sunflower as well. So this one's going to create a lot of impact either on its own in like a bud vase or something like that, just one single stem, or you could have it as part of a bouquet, which is going to create huge impact as like a feature flower. And then your standard sunflower like this one is going to look great in a bouquet, so maybe you have a few sunflowers together. I always like to do them in odd numbers, I think they look better. So you can have maybe 3, 5, 7 sunflowers together in a vase, and that's going to look great and have a huge impact. The standard size sunflower is also going to look great in a bouquet mixed with other blooms. So if you're wanting to incorporate different types of flowers, I would suggest going with the standard size. But maybe give both a go and see how they turn out and see what your preference is. I have templates for both flowers available on my website, which is howmuchsleeppaperblooms.com. So if you download the template, you will actually get both templates included. So that's for the standard size and the extra large size. So you're basically getting 2 flowers for the price of 1. So make sure you go and check that out at howmuchsleeppaperblooms.com. Download that and then come back here to watch the tutorial and work alongside me as I make mine. All of the links for the materials I'm using today will be in the description box below, so go and check those out. I also have links on my website for where you can buy materials from, and that's organised by country or areas of the world. Obviously, you don't want to be paying masses of shipping, so make sure you check out the one that is closest to your region as well. Start by gathering all your materials together. So first of all, I'm using heavyweight crepe paper. This is the German crepe paper from Griffith. So you want a green for your stem and for your leaves. You'll also want a yellow for the petals, a black for the centre, and then for the detail around the edge of the centre I also use a gold and an orange. You'll also want some wire, some thick and some thin, so I would recommend 2 in either a 22 or 24 gauge and 1 in a 16 or 18 gauge. You'll want some sharp pointy scissors, some pliers. You can use floral tape if you prefer, although it's not necessary. I'd recommend some matte finish mud podge and a paintbrush, although again this is optional. Then you'll want some tacky glue and a little pot to decant that into, and a cocktail stick. And then you want some pan pastels in either a yellow or a brown or both, and a small sponge applicator as well. And then finally you'll also want a template to work from. So this is available from my website, which is howmuchsleeppaperblooms.com. I'll have the exact link in the description box for you below. As I mentioned before, you can use either template for this tutorial, so just decide if you'd rather make the standard size sunflower or the extra large, and then you can use the template for the rest of this tutorial. Both templates are the same for the leaves and for the other parts, but the actual petals are a different size, so make sure you pick the size before you get started. So with both flowers, getting the centre about the right size is the most important bit. I've made quite a few different flowers with smaller centres, and although they're very pretty, they look nothing like a sunflower. So the most critical part is to make sure your centre of your flower, so that's the black plus the coloured surrounding ring, is between 3 inches and 4 inches ideally. These typically are around 3.5, but they don't need to be that precise. So just aim for in that vicinity of 3 to 4 inch diameter. There are also so many different varieties of sunflower out there as well. So if you want to make the black centre bigger or smaller, that's fine. Just make the surrounding ring bigger or smaller to accommodate, so that the total is 3 to 4 inches. And that will give you different varieties of sunflower. Obviously they're all slightly different. There's not a set amount or size of that outer ring, so just make sure the overall size is the same. Okay, so to get started, we're going to cover the end of the wire with a small piece of black paper. So this is the thick stem wire, and you just need a small square of black paper. It doesn't need to be big, it's just literally to cover the end so that you don't see it. So I'm going to use tacky glue here, and I just prefer to use a cocktail stick and a small pot to decant my glue into. It just makes it easier to work with, and it actually makes it a bit tackier because the air gets to it more. So I'm just going to cover the end of the paper and then wrap that around the end of my wire. And then you want to start by cutting some strips of black paper, which are 2 inches high. Make sure that you have the paper running with the lines going top to bottom. because that's how the paper will stretch. If you do it the other way around, it won't work. And then you can just do this in sections at a time. The width of paper that you're cutting here doesn't really matter. It's just whatever amount you feel comfortable working with at any one time. So you're basically trying to cut some strips that are 2 inches tall and then stretch those all the way out as far as you possibly can. Once it's stretched all the way out, just give it a good tug at either end to make sure all of the stretch is out of it. And then I prefer to just trim the very edge off because they never quite stretch all the way out. Next, we're going to create the fringe centre. So the easiest and quickest way I find to do this is to fold your paper strip over into several layers. So it does depend on the quality of your scissors. Obviously, the sharper the scissors, the more layers you can go through, and also how big of a strip of paper that you've cut. So I'd recommend you fold it over 2, maybe 3 times to start with and see how you go. If you are struggling, you can do it just a single sheet of paper. You don't need to fold it. It will just take a lot longer. So if you can fold it over, do it as I'm doing in the video here. And then you want to start to cut slits into the paper as close together as you possibly can. It's easier said than done. You get better with practice, I promise. But yeah, try it, and you can always try it on some scrap paper if you're not sure. You want to leave a small area at the bottom which is all intact, so don't cut all the way through the paper. You probably want that to be about 1/2 inch. Don't worry about it being too precise. You just want to make sure there's enough of the paper left that you've got somewhere for the glue to stick to. Once you've done that, just open the paper up and then check to make sure that all of the slits are around about the same size. If there's any that are a bit bigger, you can just go in and trim those as well. And then you need to repeat the process several times with lots of strips of paper. Once you have your strips, you can then twist those between your finger and your thumb. The easiest thing to do is if you grab quite a few of the pieces of fringe at the same time and then twist them in a group and just separate them afterwards. It is possible to do them one by one, but that will take you forever and it's actually harder to do. So I would recommend doing it in small sections, and you can just unwrap them afterwards and that's fine. The easiest way to do it is to just scrunch them together and then roll them between your fingers. It can hurt your hands a little bit if you're doing this for any length of time, so I do suggest you do a small batch and then move on to the next stage, and then don't do too many at one go because it does hurt your hands. Once you've done a strip, open it up and then just check that you're happy with everything. If there's any pieces that haven't twisted properly, just go back in and get those now, and then just check the whole strip to make sure you're happy. You can then go in and add quite a bit of glue to the bottom section, the solid piece that we left. You want to put a decent amount of glue on at this point because it really needs to hold the whole centre of the flower together. And if you're using quite new glue, I would recommend leaving this in the open air for a little while just so that it gets tackier and it makes it easier to work with. If it's too fresh, it will slip and slide quite a lot as you're adding it to the stem, so it just makes it a bit easier for you to work with. So once you have that, take your wire with the black end on it, and you want to align it so that the top of the wire, the black piece that we covered, lines up just slightly below where you've started to cut your fringe. So the solid piece will wrap around the top of the wire and then the fringe will stick above it. You want to wrap that as tightly as you possibly can. The tighter the better. You probably will find you get glue on your fingers at this point, don't worry, that's normal. And then you want to wrap it so that the bottom edge lines up as much as possible. So you don't want it to be folding down, you want it to keep that bottom edge nice and straight. So we're aiming for the top of the fringe to all be straight and level rather than to curve. So do this with the first piece, and then you want to go back in and do that with the next piece as well. You can also go in between layers and just push the ends while the glue is still a little bit wet, just to make sure that's all aligned properly. And I like to just tighten up that centre because it can get quite fluffy, and for a sunflower you want it to be quite tight. So then just repeat the process until the centre is about the size that you'd like. Next we're going to create the outer ring of the centre. So to do this, I like to layer my crepe paper. So I do a layer of black, followed by orange, followed by black, then the gold, and then finally another layer of black again. And I just attach those with some glue at the bottom, so the area that you would normally glue, not the area that you'll cut. And you just want to make sure you put quite a bit of glue on that, because ultimately that's going to hold the whole centre of the flower together. Again, it works quite well if you wait for this to be tacky. So when I'm adding these layers of paper, I just make sure they all align at the bottom. Don't worry if the top is slightly out or the sides, just focus on the bottom first, and then you can go back in and trim that afterwards. Make sure you press down firmly between each layer of paper to squeeze out any air bubbles too. Then once you have all your paper glued together, you can just trim off the edge where they don't line up. So you'll probably find you have to do that at the top as well as the sides. To make it easier to trim down the top, you can fold the paper over several times and then just align the bottom edge and just go in and then trim the top. Next, you're going to go in and fringe the paper again in exactly the same way as we did before. Because you've got several layers of paper already, you probably can't fold over at this stage, you can just go through them one at a time. And then again, once that's done, you want to go in and twist your paper in exactly the same way as before. Once you've twisted each section, just make sure you separate them out properly so that you get the full benefit of the different coloured papers. You might find you have a few small pieces that just fall off. As you can see, there's a little piece of black that's fallen off here. That's totally fine, don't worry, it's not going to make any impact to the finished flower. Once that's done, add your glue again. Again, you want it to be nice and tacky before you attach it, so make sure you have a good amount of glue on your paper. And when you come to attach that to the centre, make sure that the outer circle is sticking up slightly from the black centre. This bit can be a bit fiddly to try and wrap it around, especially because you've got the several layers all attached at once. So just take your time and wrap it around slowly to make sure you get the right effect. So it's a good idea to leave that to dry for a few hours, if not overnight, just to make sure it's all set. So while you're doing that, you can get started on your petals. So for this tutorial, I'll be making the standard sunflower, but the process is exactly the same if you're doing the large sunflower. The only difference is the size of the petals, but the actual design and the placement, everything is exactly the same. To start with, we're going to stretch out the yellow crepe paper. So ideally you'd like this to be around 90% stretched, so not quite all the way stretched out, so there's a little bit of stretch left in it, but not too much. It doesn't have to be too precise, you just want there to be a bit of room for manoeuvre, that's all. So go ahead and stretch that out, and then I like to just trim off the edge of the paper where it doesn't fully stretch. So you can then cut your petals using the templates. Make sure that the grey lines of the paper follow the lines on the template. So in this case, that's running top to bottom. And you can also fold over the paper into several layers and cut out your petals a few at a time. It's a lot quicker if you can do it that way. But obviously you do need sharp scissors to be able to do it. So if your petals are getting like rough, jagged edges, that's a sign that your scissors are not sharp enough or that you've got too many layers of paper. I usually do 3 or 4 layers of paper at the most, but I do have quite sharp scissors and I always sharpen them before each flower as well. So you might find you can only do 1 or 2 at a time. So go ahead and cut out all of the petals from your templates. And just quickly check each petal and trim off any rough edges or any bits that haven't quite cut properly. The quantities that I've included on the template are a guide, so you might find that you need a few more, possibly even a few less, but typically I would say more. Start with these quantities. If you really feel that your flower needs a few extra, then just go ahead and add them in. They don't need to be the exact amount. And obviously in nature there'd be different quantities as well. The next step is to add colour to the petals. So to do this you can use a combination of colours of pan pastel or just one single colour, however you prefer. It depends how much contrast you want to your sunflowers. So personally I prefer to use just this single shade, but if you want something that's not quite as intense colouring, you could actually use this with a combination of a lighter yellow as well. So at the moment I'm using Pan Pastel Burnt Sienna, but also if you use the yellow ochre, that gets quite a nice combination as well and it's not quite as intense. So it just really depends how dramatic you want your sunflowers to be. So to apply the pastel, you can use either a soft fluffy brush, like a paintbrush or a makeup brush, or actually I prefer to use a makeup sponge just because they're the right kind of size and they're easy to work with, and they're usually pretty cheap to buy lots of as well, so you don't have to worry about throwing them away afterwards. So first of all, go through and do your first batch of petals. You will probably get messy fingers doing this, so make sure to put something down to protect your workspace, and you probably want to wash your hands quite frequently as well. And then once you've coloured all of the petals, both front and back, you want to go ahead and curl them so that we get a bit of shape to them. So to shape these petals, we don't actually need to do too much, you just want to put a slight bend on them really. So you just want to slowly curve those around. You can stretch those between your fingers and just gently curl the top to the bottom. It doesn't need a lot of work to each petal, it's just to get more of a slight curve to it. And then the way that we add the shape onto these petals to get the kind of movement in the flower is I take about half of the batch here, so it doesn't need to be precise, you can do more or less if you prefer. And I just add a little bit of glue at the bottom, so you don't need much at all, maybe just like a small chunk at the bottom in a line. Let those all go slightly tacky, and then you want to pinch the bottom of the petal together so that it kind of folds over, and that's what creates the shape and the movement in it. I usually just hold those together for a few seconds just to make sure it's stuck, and this is where having very tacky glue actually really helps. Sometimes you might need to just go back in and pinch them again if they've not quite stuck. So go in and do that for about half of the petals. And then for the other half, we're just going to add glue to the bottom of the petal in the same way as you would normally. So here that needs to be around 1/4 to 1/2 inch tall. And then for those petals that we previously glued, what you need to do is just twist that to one side so that you've got a flat surface to stick to the flower. So you'll probably see there's a bit of a natural curve to either side. So follow the curve of how it's already glued, and just twist it either left or right so that you've got the flat surface, and then add glue to that. Try to do a mix of the two, so some to the left and some to the right, and that's going to make your flower look more natural. And then starting with your twisted petals, you want to push those up so that the start of the twist is aligned with the underside of the fringe. So that makes more sense if you just watch what I'm doing here. So where I'm pointing now is where the petal should start to curve from. So obviously depends on how much glue you put on and how much of your petal you twisted, but basically you want it to start from the underside of that fringe. so that you don't really see the twisted bit, you just see the fact that the petal's moving. So space those randomly. Try not to be too symmetrical with this because then it won't look as natural. And then once you've done all of those, you can go to your flat petals and just kind of fill the gaps in. In terms of placement for sunflower petals, they tend to have 2 or 3 very close together, so they're not quite overlapping, but there's like maybe a slight offset. So you can see here that I'm adding them next to the ones I've just added. So basically wherever you've just put your twisted petal, then put a flat petal just slightly offset from it. And you will still have some gaps, that's totally fine, we'll fill those in afterwards. A little trick that makes life a bit easier when you're working is just to fold your wire in half like this, so you can just bend it over, and that really helps when you're looking at the flower from the top and the bottom quite frequently. It just makes it a lot easier to work with, and then you can just bend it back when you're done. And then for the next batch of petals we're going to do exactly the same thing. So again, we're going to add the colour. It's exactly the same process. Personally, I like to add a bit more colour as I progress towards the outside of the flower, so this batch will go slightly higher up the petal than the first batch. Again, we're going to pinch about half of the petals and glue them and then twist them and keep the other half flat. If you prefer, you can do more or less of each option. I'm going to start with the gaps that were left previously, so I want to fill in as many gaps as I can with the twisted petals. You might find that they twist in the wrong direction like this one is doing, so just twist that round while it's still wet and then that should sit in the right place. I do find that as you're doing this, it helps to look from the top of the flower as well, so you might want to just keep rotating it and just make sure everything looks about right. And then for the flat petals, again, we're just going to fill any of the gaps, make sure they're all covered, and make sure we've got that slight offset and overlay of all the previous petals. And you'll notice as I'm working, I keep twisting the flower round. So that just really helps you to make sure you're not putting everything in one position. It's very easy to miss gaps when you're just working on one side of the flower. So just keep rotating it and you'll find more and more gaps as you go. The process is the same for the next batch of petals. For this next batch though, I don't do the twisted petals, I just do the flat ones. And then you just work your way around adding more petals, making sure that you're filling the gaps as you go. So there's a slightly different technique for this last set of petals, and that's just to get them to curl slightly to one side. So we're going to stretch each petal in the same way as we did before, with a slight curve, sort of top to bottom and left to right as well. But in addition to that, you want it to bend to one side. So if you put your thumbs together around 2/3 of the way up the petal, have one thumb slightly higher than the other, and then gently pull on the paper sort of left to right. And because your thumbs are at different heights, that'll make the petal bend in one direction or the other. So you want to do a variety of those. So do some with the left thumb higher and some with the right thumb higher, and then they'll bend in different directions and it'll look more natural. Again, you want to do this with about half of the petals. So add the glue to all of the petals, and then again we'll just work our way around the flower, filling in any gaps and making sure that we've got that overlap all the way around. And as before, don't forget to check from the top of the flower as well. Then moving on to the stem. So the wire I'm using is a 16 gauge and it's paper covered with this craft paper to make it a little bit thicker, but it's still very thin and quite flimsy as well, especially given the weight of the flower on this stem. Obviously there's a lot of petals on here, there's a lot of paper, so it's going to be quite heavy. So in order to fasten up the stem, we're going to add layers of crepe paper. Now you could just use floral tape for this, but you'd probably end up using several rolls and it'd get very expensive. So the best way to do it is actually just to use scraps of your crepe paper. So I'm using this green for the finished stem of my flower, but it's one of my favourite colours and I use it quite a lot, so I don't have as much of it left. I also have other colours that I rarely use, like this blue for example, which came as part of a set. So because you won't see it in the finished flower, I'm just going to use up this blue instead to wrap my stem. So you could do this with scraps of crepe paper as well if you prefer. So it looks a bit strange whilst you're doing it, but I promise you won't see any of the blue when we're done. So all you need to do is fold over your paper several times and then cut strips which are anything from about 1/2 inch tall through to about 1 inch, 1.5 inches, depending how you prefer to work. And then stretch them all the way out, cover them in glue, and then just wrap them around your stem. You'll see I'm cutting my strips in half. That's completely optional, I just find it easy to work with smaller pieces. There's a few different techniques you can use to wrap the stem, so just see which you prefer. So you can either roll the stem itself or roll the paper. You can roll it all around one section at a time to get the right thickness in one area, or you can just do a thin layer over the whole stem and then come back and do the rest again and again. It just really depends what you find the easiest to do. It gets quite fiddly towards the very top of the flower because you need to get the thickness right up to the base of the actual petals. So just focus on that area as one separate item if you need to. And basically just work your way up and down the stem until it's all covered to the thickness that you would like. Obviously a sunflower stem is quite thick in nature, so use that as your guide. If you're going to have this in a vase where you're not going to see the stem, then you don't need to worry about it too much. But do make sure that you're doing at least some thickness to it, because the added glue will actually give the flower strength and help it stand up and stop it drooping. If you know the length of stem that you're going to use, then now's a good time to trim it with the pliers as well. Once you have the stem to the right thickness, then do the same process again with the green paper to wrap it completely. For the leaves, stretch your crepe paper out completely. Again, I like to trim the edges that haven't stretched off just so that you don't use them by accident. And then using the leaf template, line up the 3 lines on the template with the lines of the grain in the paper. You'll notice that the templates have these little notches cut out. You can either cut these out now or you can do them later if you prefer. I'm going to cover my leaves with Mod Podge, which will create a hard surface, and I find it easier to cut these out after I've done that. If you're not going to use Mod Podge, then I suggest you do it at this stage. Once you have all the leaves cut out, you want to start with the smallest. So this is 2 of the same shaped leaves. You want to cover one of them completely with the glue and try and get the glue right up to the edges of the paper. Then take one of your thinner wires and put that about halfway up from the bottom of the leaf. Then you want to take the other side of the leaf and align that with the edges of the first one. Press that all together and make sure that that's going to be fully set, and then just squeeze out any air bubbles or excess glue. You can leave that to dry and then we'll trim it once it's dry. For the leaves, you want to add a line of glue down one side. Press in the first piece of wire about ½ an inch from the top of the leaf, and then do the same for each of them. You're only doing this to 1/2 of each leaf. Again, this works best when the glue is really tacky, so it's better if you can leave it for a while to dry in between. Then just add a really thin line of glue over the top of the wire itself, and then using your thumb you want to just wrap the paper around. It's often easiest if you actually do this with your nail so that you can get it nice and tight to the wire and that you're not wrapping too much of the paper around. You want to make sure that the wire is completely covered and that all of the edges are nice and crisp. Make sure that you flip over the leaf so that you can check the other side and make sure it's nice and crisp. And then once you're happy with it, you can add another layer of glue along the back edge of this. And line up the other half of the leaf so that it covers what you've just done. So that will hide any mess that you've made with the glue as well, and it'll finish off the leaf nice and neatly. Then you just want to go through and press both sides together, make sure you're squeezing out any gaps, removing any bits of excess glue, and just make sure that's really nicely well stuck. And then we're just going to do the same thing for the other two leaves as well. If you find that the top of the leaves don't quite line up at this stage, that's fine. When you're pressing them together, make sure they line up at the bottom because that's the harder one to trim. And then we'll go back in and trim those once they're dry. Once that's all done, you can go back and trim any rough edges and also trim the tops of the leaves if it didn't quite line up. The next step is optional, but I do prefer to do it to all of my leaves, and that's to add a layer of Mod Podge. So that really stiffens the leaf and it also makes it look so much more realistic. Even with the matte finish Mod Podge, it adds a nice gloss to your leaves, and it just looks so much more realistic than if you don't do it. If you don't have any Mod Podge, you could use watered down PVA or craft glue, but if you can get your hands on some of the actual Mod Podge brand, then I do highly recommend it. And then using a paintbrush, you want to paint this onto the leaf. Make sure you follow the grain lines of the paper and really brush that into each of the grains. Ideally, I would say do one side of the leaf at a time and then stand it up to dry, and then once it's dry do the other side because it makes it a lot easier to work with and a lot less messy. But it depends how much time you have to work. You can do both sides at the same time, it's just it gets a bit messy because you have to touch the wet glue. And then make sure you stand that up in something to dry. So I use my cocktail sticks in a little pot because it creates a nice little holder for them. But any kind of vase or jar that you've got, that you can just stand it up to dry completely in there. Once that's done, we're going to move on to the calyx. So the process for each of the calyx is the same, there's just different sizes to work with. So first of all, we're going to curve them in the same way as we did with the petals. So you stretch out the sides and then curve the top and bottom. And then once you've done that, you want to twist the very top edge of the calyx. So you want to do this with the larger calyx first, and then when it comes to adding the glue, you want to add that to the opposite side. So you're actually adding glue to the back so that it's curling away from the flower. When you come to add them to the flower, you want to overlap each calyx with its neighbour so there's no gaps. You want to line it up so that the bottom of the calyx touches the stem, but also then it will cover all of the workings of the flower that we've been doing. So all of the black and all of that base of the flower will be completely covered and hidden. Again, this is one of those areas where if you need more calyx, then you can just add some more. You don't need to just do the fixed amount as per the template. If you've made your flower a bit larger, you might find you need a few extras. So that's the first layer done. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing for the next layer. When you come to place this next layer, again start from the same position on the base, but try and align the top of the calyx with the gaps between the previous ones. And then for the final layer, we're going to do the same thing again, just with the smaller calyxes. When you're placing these, try to overlap them so that the point fills the gap created by the previous layer. If you find that the join between the stem and the calyx is a little bit messy, you can always wrap another piece of crepe paper around to neaten the edges. The final stage is to finish and attach the leaves. So first of all, if you've painted them with Mod Podge, you might find they're a little bit crinkled, so just smooth those out so they're nice and flat. And then if you didn't add the notch detail earlier on, you want to go ahead and cut those in now. So you can either do that either freehand like I'm doing or using the template, whichever you prefer. I do find it's a lot easier to do this with the point of the leaf facing towards you. So if you have the point facing towards you, you can do one side and then flip it over to do the other side. If you do it the other way, it's kind of awkward to get the detail that you need. And you will also need some sharp scissors to do this, ideally the ones that cut right to the point at the very edge. Once you've cut all 4 of your leaves, we're then going to bend them into the right shape. So we're going to start with the smallest one first of all. For this leaf, we just want a slight bend on it, so it'll be like a loose C shape in profile. You want the wire to stay straight so that the leaf bends kind of up and over away from the stem. The reason for this is that we don't want to see any of the wire when we're done, so we're going to attach that with a big blob of glue and then wrap a strip of crepe paper around, and you can add more glue as you work or do it in advance, whichever you prefer. This is going to act in exactly the same way as floral tape would, but obviously we're just trying to avoid using rolls upon rolls of floral tape. So in terms of positioning, you want this first leaf to be around about 1 inch from the bottom of the calyxes. It doesn't have to be too precise, but I would say you want these leaves to be near to the top of the flower. They also need to be staggered so that it looks more natural. In nature, they are slightly offset from one another, so ideally I'd say around about 1/2 inch between each of the leaves. You can go a little bit further apart if you prefer, but once it's in a vase, you're going to end up with your leaves quite low down the stem if you do that. For the other 3 leaves, we're going to bend them to be an S shape inside profile, so kind of like a loose S. So again, you want the wire to be straight and then the top of the leaf to bend up and over, and then down, and it can point back up at the end. To attach them, we'll do exactly the same thing using strips of crepe paper and just cover those in glue and wrap them tightly around each leaf. If you find that 2 of your wires, or even all 3 of them, finish in the same place, you can actually go in and just trim those with the pliers. That just helps to stagger them so that you don't get a big lump once you cover it in the crepe paper. The edge can be quite sharp though, so make sure that you tuck that into the flower and then cover it with a couple of layers of crepe paper too. And then the last step is just to wrap a few more layers of crepe paper around the stem until all of the wire is hidden. So I hope you've enjoyed making your sunflowers. I would absolutely love to see how they turn out if you're happy to share. I do love to feature your work on my social media and also on my website on the customer gallery. So if you're happy to share, please tag me on Instagram. It's tarmuchley_paperblooms, or on Facebook. Or email me blooms@tarmuchley.com. If you haven't already tried some of my other tutorials, then make sure you check out the website tarmuchleypaperblooms.com. There's also lots of free tutorials on there that you can try, and make sure you join my email list to be notified when I launch the next tutorial, and also for tips and tricks for paper flower making too. I am currently on a form of maternity leave. I have a 5-month-old little boy called Reggie, and he keeps me very busy without any childcare. So I'm making videos as frequently as I can, but they might not be that consistent. So make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that you get the notification when I do launch a new video, and hit the little notification bell as well. And if you join the email list, I will also email to let you know when there's a new tutorial live. And also make sure to check out some of the other videos on my channel. I have lots of advice on care and maintenance for your paper flowers, how to repair damaged flowers, how to stop them fading in sunlight and things like that. So go and check those out and have a look at some of the other tutorials while you're there. If you have any questions, then drop them in the comments box below and I'll do my best to help, or you can drop me an email as well. That's blooms@tarmuchley.com. And hopefully I'll be bringing you another tutorial again very soon. And like I say, I'm working on stuff at the moment, and hopefully I'll get that to you as soon as my son permits. So until next time, happy flower making.